agitation, and the one-on-one. Intro. Agitation in organizing is the spark that creates the wildfire. Like in all parts of life, our emotions lead, our thoughts agree, and then our behavior follows. In part, AEIOU is about channeling this natural progression of human action. Finding the issue. One mistake new and over-eager organizers sometimes make is that they treat the first part of agitate, in which you identify issues that affect your co-workers, like a game of 20 questions. What do you think of the scheduling? I sure wish we got paid more around here, right? Do you get enough sick time? The GM sure is a pain, isn't he? Despite this appearing on the surface like a comprehensive way to survey someone's feelings about possible issues, it actually comes off as repeatedly presuming something about them in a way that can shut down meaningful conversation. Furthermore, if they see your strategy for what it is, the person you're talking with might feel like you're not interested in actually listening to them. The best way to find the issue isn't to fixate on asking the perfect question, but rather is to build relationships with co-workers. If the relationships are sincere and open, people will feel comfortable and naturally want to share what they're going through, including how they feel about work. Of course, building relationships is often easier said than done, but that's where our power really lies. When someone does mention a grievance in the context of a developing workplace relationship, you can create space to explore that grievance with them. Try to find ways to unearth the underlying effects that grievance is having. All too often, workers, myself included, get caught up in more abstract rationalizations for grievances, thinking that there's no other way the workplace could be run. When we think like that, we place the onus of the problem on ourselves and implicitly try to just suck it up and blunt our feelings about an issue. Rather, if we become curious about the many ways grievances impact us, only then can we come to an accurate representation of the problem. From there, we can start to relocate the source of the grievance from ourselves to the workplace policy or the boss or whatever feature of capitalism is making us feel bad or stressed at work. Cycles of emotion. Emotions of all kinds are the motivators of human action. When going through the agitate part of AEIOU, anger is often where we end up, but often there's many other emotions we go through to get to that point. Let me explain. I work with young kids for my job. My job goes well when I'm able to help meet kids' needs and empower them to learn and grow. When my job goes well, I often feel happy, and the kids I work with do too. Almost all of us have some kind of reference point for what our job is supposed to look like when it's going well. Even if it's never been realized, we often know intuitively how it should look. When our job goes well, we feel a sense of competence, accomplishment, satisfaction, and togetherness. When I'm not able to do my job because of short-staffing or lack of proper equipment, then my first reaction is one of frustration of trying but failing to do my job. This can turn into sadness as I watch kids struggle, disengage, and throw fit sadness because I know they are deserving of love and support, but due to the circumstances I am not able to provide them with what they deserve. When it's clear that it's not my own failing that is creating this situation, but those with power over me and my industry who are not providing the necessary resources, I feel angry. It's usually in my anger about some issue that I come to the conclusion, this is bullshit, and I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm going to do something about it. Anger, more than any of the other emotions, is the one that directs us to confront our circumstances and push for change. This is why the first part of AEIOU is called agitate. In some of our one-on-one people are able to, on their own, identify the problems that affect them and get angry about the way they are treated. This makes the agitate step more straightforward, but what do we do when people don't seem to get upset at the problems around them? As organizers who are building well-rounded relationships with our co-workers, we must not only hone in on anger. We all go through cycles of emotions, and each emotion is designed to orient us to our environments through thought and action in useful ways. While anger is often the emotion that finally pushes us to take action, we can't get angry if we don't also have other feelings about work. Anger is never felt in a vacuum and rather takes other emotions as reference points. In our one-on-one with co-workers, it often helps to talk about what makes us happy or anxious on the job, or how our job affects our home life in ways that make us happy or anxious. Anger is the distance between the job state that makes us happy and energized and the job state that makes us sad and defeated. Anger arises out of the recognition of this gap, combined with the knowledge that it doesn't have to be this way. I become most motivated to change my environment when I become consciously aware of all of these dynamics, when I can palpably recall the joy I feel when I'm able to really help kids learn, and can just as easily recall the sadness in those instances where kids I work with are educationally abandoned. That's when the anger becomes real, immediate, and grasps for solutions, aka leads to the next step in AEIOU called educate. So if in one-on-one with co-workers you have a hard time identifying issues and the real effects of those issues, the solution is often not to exhaustively examine every aspect of work in order to find something that agitates them. A related and also flawed strategy that I've used when agitate isn't going smoothly is that I get visibly angry about the issues myself, hoping that when they see it, it will make them angry too. But this is a mistake and almost never works, and is what is responsible for the stereotype of the angry, rambling radical. If someone doesn't feel angry about a situation, trying to make them feel angry by extension of your own anger is going to come off as desperate and forced. One rule of thumb that union organizer Jane McAlevey uses is that you are never allowed to be more angry in a one-on-one than the person you're talking with . People become sincerely angry about problems because of their own thought process about how work affects them, not because they want to follow your example. When someone identifies what makes them angry about work and they feel angry about it, it's good to validate that anger and feel it with them, but never try to lead with your own emotions before they've had a chance to uncover their emotions for themselves. Counterintuitively then, when a co-worker seems uninterested in workplace issues or talking about grievances, the best thing to discuss is makes them happy about their job. Once that is explored, it can be easier to dig into the other complexities and issues at work that can eventually lead to what people want their job to be like and how to make it happen. To restate a point that we need to constantly remind ourselves of, don't rush, especially when organizing conversations aren't happening the way you expect them to. These fuller explorations of the situations at work and how we relate to them in emotionally complex ways take far more than a single one-on-one conversation. Shock is not a useful tool for agitating. There are many emotional reactions to injustice, and I think organizers will be most effective if they avoid using or soliciting shock as an agitational tool. This is a mistake I've made and come to think more deeply about with a fellow organizer of mine. The essence of shock as a tool of agitation is about being jolted into indignation for the status quo not working as advertised. For example, I can't believe the boss just fired Jill. That's not supposed to happen. She said that everyone would get a fair hearing and that no one would be fired for talking about the accident last week that made some workers sick. The problem with shock is that it is framed around the way the status quo is supposed to work and has, as its implicit aim, the return to the status quo. This obscures deeper causes of workplace grievances and obviates the ability to think critically about these causes and what deeper solutions might be. In the example of the boss firing Jill, using this kind of shock has the implied solution of either the current boss following the rules or finding a different boss to follow the rules. The idea of the boss following the rules is the status quo the workers have been told about, and shock is the disbelief that the boss did not follow the rules. This tends to frame the solution as an appeal to authority that the boss should follow the rules, which displaces the more radical solution of building worker power to challenge the boss's authority directly around grievances. In this way, shock is a liberal form of agitation in that it seeks a return to the normal they imagined existed without demanding more fundamental change. Applying this analysis to a more prominent contemporary issue, the opposition to Trump by liberals is framed around shock. He did what? I'm so shocked he would do that. Presidents can't do that. This kind of shock leads directly to proposed solutions of a return to normalcy like that of Obama or Bush or one of the more reasonable or smart presidents. Rather, the radical kind of agitation around Trump looks at the deeper causes of his actions and reveals how his actions are in fact not so much a deviation from the normal, but just one expression of that normal. In this kind of agitation, the solution is not a return to normal, which itself was rife with racism and inequality and injustice, but to imagine and create deeper systemic change. Returning to the workplace example, the goal is to avoid using or encouraging shock as an agitational tool. One way to make this mistake is a variant of the "my anger will wear off on you" type that I mentioned above. Acting really shocked as a way to agitate your co-workers will not get you where you want to go. But similarly, just spouting a more radical analysis that tells others what to think won't work either. For example, this illustrates the power our boss has over us under capitalism. We have to use our leverage as workers to undermine the boss's power and win concessions. As always, agitate should be about asking questions. Why do you think they fired Jill? Why didn't the boss stick to her word? Do you think what happened to Jill could happen to any of us? Good agitate questions not only help highlight the effects of the grievance, but they reveal class relations that help people understand the self-interests of different actors in the workplace. At its best, this leads to an understanding that the only way to counter the boss's unilateral authority to punish workers according to her own interests is for workers to come together through action and in a union to protect and advance their own interests. I'm not saying that the organizer needs to maintain a cool, detached, unemotional demeanor, only that emotions other than shock can be used that lead to more productive analyses and actions. Expressing anger at the injustices of people being mistreated is different than expressing shock that someone broke the rules. As I said above, emotions are the motivators of behavior, and if we understand and control, not dampen our emotions, we can use them to best advance our goals. In my organizing, I think I've sometimes implicitly tried to appeal to the perceived liberal sentiments of co-workers by expressing or trying to solicit shock at things not going the way they're supposed to. I think I've also hoped that this shock would impel people to action more quickly, when in fact it has probably had the opposite effect because it obscured the dynamics behind the grievances. In retrospect, I think this all has been a mistake, and I've had to rethink how I approach agitation. Levels of agitation. Agitation is where the why for organizing comes from. Like so much of human behavior, our first step towards direct action comes from our feelings. When agitation has been done well, it provides the fuel to go the distance through the rest of AEIOU. Like so many aspects of organizing, I've had to learn to not rush through things, and this applies especially to agitation. I have a tendency to dash on to educate after having just explored some grievance at a very shallow level. Of course, it depends on the person you're organizing with, but most often I find that I run into problems later in AEIOU if agitate is not given a fuller treatment. To illustrate this, I'm going to pose the idea of levels of agitation using a personal example. I worked at a summer school right after college, where I was given a class full of students with no training and was expected to essentially run an academic classroom. This wasn't a fun and games type of summer school. It was a rich parents want their kids to be really smart, so they make them do academic work all day during the summer type of summer school. I was woefully underprepared and terribly overwhelmed. This was before I had any exposure to organizing ideas. It was obvious enough to me how miserable of a job this was, and most of the staff complained to each other about it at lunch. The lunchroom complaints were just pure surface level, level 1 kinds of agitation. We complained about how much work we had to do and often directed frustration at the kids instead of at the school's directors. Why can't they just sit still for 1 hour? That's all I need, just 1 hour for them to get through some work. You can't even afford to live in a closet in Los Angeles making on $10/HR. This kind of collective venting is an important coping mechanism for getting through the day. This venting can be a good starting place from which to have a more intentional, agitate conversation, but on its own, venting does nothing to push workers towards action. On a deeper level, it was becoming clearer to me with each passing week. I was there how harmful this whole setup was for the kids and the psychological toll it was taking on me, where I was stressed out all the time and started to absolutely dread coming to work. I ended up quitting a month before the term was over because I just couldn't make myself yell at kids anymore. This is a kind of 2ND level agitation, where you're able to articulate how the issue is actually affecting you and others in a personal and harmful way. On a third level of agitation, only years later did I become aware of how close to home this issue was for me. I was leading a section on agitation during an organizing training and used this example from my own work history as part of a role play where participants were acting as the organizer and I was acting as a co-worker, and they were practicing agitation on me. Over the course of the agitational conversation, they asked me open-ended questions, and I talked about how I hated yelling at kids, how when I was a kid, I hated when my teachers yelled because it crushed the potential to act and think in open and creative ways. The participant said back to me, "It sounds like you've become what you always hated." While all of those elements were always floating around in my experience and memories at that summer school, I never made that connection so explicitly, and when the training participants said back to me in a more organized way what I was already talking about, it clicked. Instead of possessing only a vague and only partly self-aware stew of feelings and circumstances, I now understood clearly what I felt and why. The key part of this third level of agitation is about relating core personal values to the way our job affects us. For me, my core values of creativity and the freedom to learn were violated in a deep way by my role as a teacher who yelled all day at that summer school. If someone had organized me all those years ago and helped me see then what I came to realize in this training, and if they had asked if I wanted to take action to solve the problem, I would have been fully bought in. Instead, 10 years later here, I am with a renewed commitment to making the education system a better place because of this delayed revelation. The core values we hold, we are not always conscious of, and certainly it's never obvious how they relate to our complex lives at work. But when that relationship is made clear, it is one of the most powerful motivators for anyone to do anything. Of course, in your one-on-one conversations, you shouldn't expect to stimulate life-changing revelations every time. Getting to level 1 from nothing is sometimes a challenge, and usually getting from level 1 to level 2 is a difficult but enormous accomplishment in itself, and brings up all sorts of deeply felt emotions that people can draw from to stand up for themselves at work. In the context of more trusting relationships built with our co-workers, Over months and years, we can mutually and gradually deepen our self-awareness and self-realization. Conclusion. As the part of AEU that deals directly with the emotions of organizing, the agitation step can be an object of endless analysis and strategizing. As organizers, we must be finely attuned to the way emotions interact in ourselves and others. Organizing at its best is about harnessing the power of our emotions to bring about a better world. #Educate and the one-on-one. Intro. If you want to solve a problem in your workplace that you've discussed in the Agitate step of AEU, you need a plan. The Educate step of AEU is about how to make a plan in talking with a coworker. Sometimes my writings on this blog are meant to be succinct and hit home a point in a punchy way. Sometimes my writings, as in this post, are messier and more tedious as I wrestle with problems that I haven't mastered yet, and I want to get my hands dirty. Educate. Educate has the most sub-steps within it of all the AEIOU parts, so it's partly challenging because there's a lot to keep in mind while also balancing all the usual complexities of an organizing conversation. For this reason, this is the part of AEIOU that most benefited from thinking through things before the one-on-one. I have a separate post on how to prep for one-on-one S, but suffice to say here that I usually find it very helpful to sketch out on paper beforehand the questions and stories I might want to use in an educate conversation so that I'm not totally flying by the seat of my pants. As I point out in my Species of One-on-One S post, educate can play out differently depending on whether you're exploring how to address a grievance with someone who has the leeway to come up with a plan themselves, which this post will apply more closely to, or whether you're doing educate with someone in the context of an existing campaign with pre-existing demands, like a contract campaign. I'm going to go over the 3 sub-questions of educate in order and elaborate in more detail the challenges and opportunities that commonly arise. What would fix the problem? After emerging from the agitate part of the conversation, where a grievance is identified and the effects of that grievance are explored, you need to be prepared to launch into educate. You want to frame things positively, underscore what would fix the problem, so that the negative emotions of agitate aren't just left to fester so that people can see themselves as not just emotional sponges soaking up the problems in their environments, but also as agents with the potential to think and create change. Let's say that you have a coworker, Pat, who's being harassed by a supervisor named Todd. Todd is verbally aggressive and says demeaning things about Pat even when Pat is in the room. If you're in a one-on-one with Pat outside of work and you ask Pat what would fix the problem, they might give a range of answers. Quitting, getting transferred to a different department, getting Todd fired, forcing Todd to stop. Depending on the circumstances, any of these might be strategic or reasonable. As the organizer, you can ask follow-up questions to see what Pat wants and what makes sense for them. Some answers Pat gives might not seem like it's really what Pat wants, and you can help explore that with follow-up questions. If Pat says quitting would solve the problem, you could ask, "Do you want to quit?" If so, you can ask if there is anything you can do to help them with that. Sometimes someone might suggest quitting as the fix without really having explored or being aware of other possibilities. As an organizer in this kind of gray area, you can make suggestions, but obviously you don't want to push people to do anything that they don't want or that could be harmful, like staying in a bad situation without a reasonable possibility of changing it. Not every grievance leads to further organizing that results in collective action, and while collective action is what's needed to build power, forcing it is just going to do harm and weaken your organizing in the long run. Your concept of what a good organizer is should overlap entirely with your concept of what a good person is. But if in follow-up questions, Pat really doesn't want to quit because much of the job they really like, then you can start asking about other things that might fix the problem. Maybe you and Pat settle on the idea that getting Todd to stop would fix the problem and is realistic. Perhaps the reasoning is that Todd is selective in who he is harassing towards, and if you think he's harassing because he's just a bully who thinks he can get away with it, maybe Todd will stop if he faces pushback from workers. Who can give us what we want? In this scenario, Todd himself can fix the problem by changing his behavior. But if the situation were different and Todd wasn't really a selective bully and was a jerk to everyone, the fix might be getting Todd fired. In that case, the "who can give us what we want" answer would be Todd's boss, who could fire Todd. Different kinds of demands require different kinds of targets. Picking an appropriate who or target for an action is absolutely crucial to fixing the problem. As obvious as that may sound, we often get caught up in the other details and can end up with an action that is more expressive of the effects of the problem than it is a targeted attack on the causes of the problem. What collective action can we take to fix the problem? Using the term collective action might not actually be the best way to phrase this question out loud, as it may seem kind of vague or confusing to those who aren't familiar with organizing terminology. But in your own mind, that's the essence of what you're exploring in this part of Educate. Dad, what do you think it would take to force Todd to stop messing with you? There's a wide range of answers Pat could give here. Maybe they suggest another co-worker speak privately with Todd to cut it out. Maybe they suggest everyone confront Todd in a staff meeting and tell him that bullying isn't allowed anymore. Those both seem like reasonable ideas worth trying. But what if Pat suggests something that seems off? For example, maybe Pat says that the two of you should approach one of the other supervisors with the complaint about Todd. As a longer-term employee who has seen the supervisor's close rank before, maybe this doesn't seem like the best option to you. You could ask, do you think the other supervisors would take us seriously? If Pat still thinks it's a good idea, even if you're skeptical and have been honest in providing all the info that would be necessary for Pat to make an informed decision, it's sometimes worth it to follow through on Pat's idea for 3 reasons. 1. If that's what Pat wants, sometimes it's best to support them in order to respect their agency, even if you privately disagree too. If you're right, and the action doesn't work, maybe it will still reveal the underlying class dynamics in the workplace that can lead to subsequent more effective approaches. 3. Maybe Pat is right, and you're wrong. Another way to think about this, if you create a crisis for the boss, they'll be forced to give in as a way to stop the crisis. This framing can help you see things from the boss's perspective and think strategically about what they don't want to happen and how you can use that to your advantage. For example, most bosses would be terrified if their workers stood up together in a staff meeting and presented some demand, especially a demand that called them out for being a bully. If there was an implicit threat of this demand being raised at future meetings until harassment stopped, this could be a true crisis for Todd, and his easiest way out would be to just stop harassing Pat. The idea of workers standing up together in a staff meeting to call out a bully is a great idea, but it might be very difficult to pull off if there hasn't been much solidarity built between co-workers yet. For those just starting to organize who find themselves in this position, how would you talk with Pat about taking action on this grievance? To many new organizers, collective action sounds like a great solution, general strike anyone, but actually pulling it off is the hard part, and that hard part is first encountered when thinking through possible solutions in Educate. There's no one-size-fits-all template for how to navigate this, but drawing out this example and possible ways forward might be helpful. A common follow-up question is to ask if your coworker thinks anyone else is affected by the problem. collective action might be easier to pull off if the grievance directly affects multiple co-workers. The importance of small actions like this is often under-recognized in organizing discourse. The dramatic actions like strikes not only get all the attention, but are also really inaccessible for someone trying to start out organizing in their workplace. To get from point A to point Z almost always takes a lot of intermediate steps, of which small actions are the essential beginnings. So if co-workers standing up in a staff meeting to openly call Todd out seems too risky given the progress of your organizing, here's a list of possible small, low-risk actions to address a problem like Todd's bullying. Coming up with a plan to talk with more co-workers about the problem is often a great next step in itself, even if it isn't exactly the whole solution in itself. Bullies often rely on their victims being silent, and so spreading the word can lead to other possibilities. You can find small ways to push back on Todd that don't require anyone sticking their neck out, like maybe at a staff meeting, a few co-workers suggest having a discussion about how the staff are embodying the company's values or coming up with a workplace code of conduct. These suggestions would put the spotlight on bad behavior that might be a clear enough, if indirect, signal to Todd that his bullshit won't be tolerated. Maybe co-workers can decide to all say lots of positive things about Pat whenever Todd's around, so that Todd gets the message that harassing them is not cool. Maybe co-workers can overwhelmingly nominate Pat as Worker of the Month repeatedly to similar effect, or maybe on Pat's birthday, you have everyone sign a birthday card for them and have Todd sign it last. Maybe co-workers can give Todd the silent treatment while subtly communicating the source of the grievance. Many of those small actions will of course be most effective if all your co-workers are on board, but many of these actions can still apply pressure if done by just 2 or 3 co-workers. Basically, you don't necessarily have to get everyone on the shop floor to totally buy in before you can take action. Furthermore, if other co-workers see that a few people were brave enough to stand up to Todd, they might become disposed to join in on future actions. Too often, people focus immediately on the biggest grievances and the biggest actions, even when those actions are not yet practical. Even if your ultimate goal is to win something big, like employer-provided healthcare, by doing some big action, like going on strike, beginning with small actions to address smaller grievances is the best way to get there. Demands. Sometimes the solution for a problem, especially around interpersonal dynamics like bullying and actions in the form of social signals, don't have to be articulated to the boss as a specific demand. However, most of the time, a well-constructed demand is absolutely critical to workers effectively asserting workplace power. Usually the specifics of a demand are hammered out when you're starting to put together all the pieces of an action, but it can come up in any part of educate and is intimately tied to educate. A good demand should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely or smart. Let's pretend that instead Pat and your co-workers wanted to try to get rid of Todd, but this is a sloppy way to articulate this demand. Get rid of Todd might be achievable, but that's really the only part of the demand that is at all decent. Throw Todd in a volcano would be a less achievable demand. Each part of a good demand serves an important purpose, but covering all of it would take me beyond the scope of this post. In the case of Todd, perhaps a smart demand could be, we demand Todd be fired by next Monday. Telling stories in Educate. The last question of Educate, what collective action can we take to fix the problem, is a good place to share a story or two if the usual line of questioning doesn't lead to an immediately convincing plan. This is perhaps the only part of AEIOU proper where the organizer has some leeway to say things that aren't immediately redirected back as questions. because society in general tries to emphasize appeals to authority and individualized actions as solutions to problems. Oftentimes, our co-workers aren't able to think up on the spot an idea for how co-workers can come together to address a problem themselves. This is where a good story that's relevant to the situation can help get the creative juices flowing for what kind of action may be effective. You never want to frame the story as, "This is what these other people did once. We should do that." Rather, the sentiment is more, "I remember hearing about a situation like this before. This is how they dealt with it. Do you think any of that would work here?" Make no promises you can't keep. When coming up with a solution, a target, and a plan for action, you should not promise any particular outcome. You don't have total control over whether the boss will give in, and by promising someone a victory, you're setting them up with unrealistic expectations and potential disillusionment if the action fails. A better way to frame this is that if workers do nothing, the problem is guaranteed not to go away, and that the best shot you have for improving the situation is by coming together with your co-workers to take action. Later, in the inoculate part of a conversation, especially when leading up to an action, that's a great place to explore possible responses by the boss: retaliation, capitulation, ignoring the demand, etc., and prepare for each possibility. My own mistakes in Educate. Some of these mistakes are still fresh in my mind and sting when I think about them, but they're also reservoirs of personal experience that I'm eager to turn into useful knowledge. I'm going to be vague with the specifics in order to protect the innocent, and of course, it was my inexperience as an organizer and capitalism that was in large part responsible for the problems below, and not any weakness of my co-workers. One thing I've done is that, when a co-worker mentions an action to address some grievance that I think won't work, I dismiss it instead of asking questions. A big top-down change was coming to the structure of my workplace, and many of us were very concerned about it. A co-worker's first reaction was for all of us to call the top boss to complain, and I politely said I didn't think that would work. Even though I was polite, I still was effectively shutting down a conversation instead of opening one up, and I could see a little bit of disappointment on this co-worker's face. More important than being nice or polite is being respectful and sincere by actually asking people what they think. For example, I could have said, "That's an interesting idea. I hope he does come to learn how bad this restructuring idea is. How do you think the top boss would respond to calls?" Luckily, I had a good relationship with this co-worker and could easily circle back around and have this conversation, but I've had to watch myself and not dismiss ideas, no matter how mistaken I think they are. It's the organizer's job to listen and ask, not tell and dictate. On the flip side, on some occasions I've made the mistake on the opposite end of the spectrum where I didn't express my own opinions at all. Once in a conversation with a co-worker, she was expressing all these ideas about actions in the workplace, but they all seemed misplaced to me and more about appealing to authority, which had already been tried repeatedly, instead of bringing bottom-up pressure on our bosses through _direct _action. I just didn't think our bosses cared about what we thought in this instance, and that they wouldn't have been affected by such appeals, and that we needed to apply direct pressure to force them to give in. I didn't want to disagree with my coworker because I didn't want her to feel demoralized, but in the moment, I just couldn't find a way to say what I wanted. The result was that I was lukewarm, not agreeing and not disagreeing to each idea my coworker mentioned in a way that zapped all of the positive energy out of the conversation and left us with no opportunities to explore the real tensions in the workplace. I left that one-on-one feeling more discouraged than I had in a long time. Looking back, what I could have done is found a way to express my ideas in the form of good questions, so that it would still be a dialogue, but one where we could explore different opinions without shutting each other down. In the moment I was trying to think of appropriate questions, But I failed because in response to her suggested actions, the only questions I could think of were alternative ideas for actions. I thought that if I posed a question like, "What if we did this other thing instead?" it would still be effectively shutting down the conversation instead of opening it up, and that it would come off as dismissive. Getting stuck in AEIOU is a universal experience of organizing, and it's critical to think back on those instances to analyze what went wrong. What I actually needed to do was find a question that redirected the conversation away from the specifics of particular actions, because that was turning into a deep rabbit hole, and towards the class dynamics underlying the context in which the actions were being proposed. That's an interesting idea for an action. Do you think our top boss will be moved if we tell them what we think? Why do you think the top boss is making this change in the first place? If we had explored the class dynamics more, we could then have later returned to discussing actions in a more grounded way. One big lesson that the above examples illustrate is that I had built up trusting relationships with both of these co-workers, and so the mistakes I made did not end our discussions entirely, but only temporarily. If you've put the effort into actually having relationships, then you have more space to make mistakes and fix them later. Organizing is far too complex to not make mistakes, even for the best organizers. Relationships allow us to be accountable to our co-workers and accountable to our own political visions without the bottom falling out with each misstep. But sometimes relationships can't save you. In one workplace I was in that had a very high rate of turnover due to workplace stress, I struggled mightily with figuring out how to support co-workers who were in very bad situations. I was relatively new to organizing in that workplace, and as workers, we really hadn't built up much solidarity or power yet. The grievances were so hard and numerous, it felt like knives were being thrown at us while we were strapped to a giant rotating wheel. Every time a co-worker quit out of concern for their mental health, I felt like I had failed. Like if I were a better organizer, we could have won some small improvements through action and made the job good enough for them to stay. Of course, I know I shouldn't be too hard on myself, and that it's capitalism that's crushing people and not me. But still, as an organizer, you want to do what's best for and with people, and not figuring it out can feel like a defeat. In these desperate circumstances, I often would rush through the educate part of AEIOU, because I knew that if action wasn't taken quickly on some dire problems, that people would start quitting en masse. I would tell a story of a possible action and ask if that would make sense here, but I'd try to strongly nudge them in that direction for the sake of expediency. Maybe this was just a lose-lose situation, but none of these actions that were discussed ever actually happened, in part because when we rushed through, educate people didn't really feel bought into what the action was about or how it dealt with the problem, or if we were really strong enough to pull it off. Everybody kept quitting from the job stress before any action could come together. For an action to really work, it has to really come from what your co-workers believe and want to do, and rushing through educate ends up undermining their ability to come to their own conclusions. It's better to give each part of AEIOU its proper time, no matter the circumstances. The larger encouragement for me has been that those co-workers who did stick around through those difficult days have a deeper understanding of the workplace. And even though we're still young grasshoppers in our growth as organizers at this job, we're slowly but surely building up a shop floor presence. Conclusion. While I've had some effective educate conversations too, I've focused more on my mistakes above because I think they contain more useful lessons. Educate to me is the hardest part of AEIOU and the one I've personally struggled with most. Perhaps more than any other part, this is where practice and experience really help. This is especially the case where the accumulation of stories, both from my own experience and even more from just talking with other organizers and reading stories of actions, has enabled me to better pull the right story or question out of my pocket at the right moment. I'm going to end by mentioning and linking to interesting examples of educate in action that are different from the kind of above story of Pat and Todd to illustrate a wider range of how educate can be used. This situation was about how rotating strikes of postal workers in Canada were declared illegal by back-to-work legislation, and the workers had to decide what to do. Organizers asked, through conversations and surveys, should we obey the legislation? And what happens if we don't? While the story doesn't end with a victory in that fight, it shows how workers were able to strategize collectively through educate conversations, how to respond to attacks on their union, and how that built power and class consciousness for the next fight. In another case, workers heard about work stoppages happening at other sites under the same employer, and organizers were able to ask their co-workers, "What do you think of that? Should we do that here?" Educate stories can be immediate and powerful when they're happening in real time, in the same kind of company or industry as you and your co-workers. As spontaneous as they may appear on the outside, waves of similar kinds of actions in an industry often are the result of savvy organizers seizing the moment by posing strategic educate questions to their co-workers. As workers, we have control over our destiny when we're able to discuss our problems and collectively determine what steps to take to solve them. Educate is where this difficult but liberating dialogue happens. Addendum. Shortly after writing the above post, I came across this story on Facebook that is a perfect illustration of an action of the kind discussed above. I was told the story is public and could be included here. Virtual organizing, small but mighty mid-city, stands up for colleague. Another inspiring show of the power of solidarity comes from Mid-City's Prescott School of Enriched Sciences, where first-grade teacher Sandra was publicly disrespected by Principal Carla during a Zoom meeting after she voiced her discomfort with the level of tension between staff and administration. In reply to her concerns, the principal offered to provide Sandra with district mental health service resources. Carla, who in her first year as principal at Mid-City posed multiple obstacles in the construction of the local school leadership council and has already been grieved several times by staff for violating their right to not be publicly reprimanded, went further and later emailed Sandra District Mental Health Resources. Outraged by this unfair treatment of a co-worker, the staff at Mid-City, under the direction of the UTLA, United Teachers Los Angeles Union chapter leaders, and with the support of their UTLA rep, decided on a virtual protest at their next staff meeting. Their plan included changing their names to Miss Sandra, I Am Sandra, and their background picture to Apologize Now, Miss Carla. Every member in their small but mighty UTLA chapter participated, also engaging in silent protest throughout the entire meeting, signing in virtually by writing their names in the chat box and refusing to unmute themselves in solidarity. Our team of 8 teachers has adopted the motto "One More Day," given to us by our amazing UTLA representative, Sandra said. We have used unity as our strength. One more day refers to the concept that to win, you only have to last one day longer than your opponent. If an apology is not forthcoming from the principal to Sandra, members are prepared to escalate. Our school has experienced an unprecedented level of retaliation and abuse from this new principal, said UTLA Vice Chair and first-grade teacher Sherry. Mid-City Prescott is a tragic example of what can happen to a high-performing school under poor leadership. This principal's strategy has been to divide and conquer, but our team has done just the opposite. We have found our strength in unity. #I is for inoculate. Introduction. It's often said that union campaigns are won or lost on the strength of their inoculation. Like roughhousing children, organizing is all fun and games until someone gets hurt, and then shit gets serious real fast. When organizing workers are attacked by the boss and haven't been prepared for it, The threat of the loss of a job can make even the most courageous worker fall into line. This should be expected and is why inoculation is so important. As discussed briefly in my Introduction to Organizing Conversations post, the inoculate part of AEIOU is about anticipating and preparing for the boss's next move and dealing with people's fears. In high-profile and more traditional unionization drives, professional union busters are often used to supplement the boss's aggression and to intimidate workers into voting no on union representation. For those who find yourselves facing union-busting consultants, knowing what to expect from them and how to fight them is critically important and has been discussed widely elsewhere. But the organizing approach advocated on this blog often takes other forms, such as organizing in a workplace already formally represented by a union or organizing in a non-unionized workplace without the goal of union representation. In these and other cases, boss aggression against workers often looks different than having big union busters show up at work. In this post, I'll go deeper into inoculation as it occurs at the level of workers taking direct action themselves, irrespective of if it's connected to a formal unionization drive. Make sure no one suffers alone. Often the scariest thing about retaliation or threats of retaliation is having to go through it alone. Bosses have a tremendous amount of power in the workplace. They know it, and they use that power to intimidate psychologically as often as they use it to make someone's material conditions worse. The psychological intimidation goes down a lot if you can share what you're going through with a coworker, or even better, if all your coworkers hear about it and give you sympathy and get mad at the boss. Whether workplace discipline is explicitly connected to retaliation for organizing or not, the best psychological shield against boss aggression is creating a community of care and mutual support among coworkers. One time I was called into the boss's office and given a hard time. While it wasn't formally connected to any discipline and was at most only loosely connected to my organizing, it was clear this boss was trying to push their weight around and make me feel insecure and establish their authority over me. It felt humiliating, but I realized that they were just trying to mess with me. I knew trying to argue or fight them in that moment would have been futile and would likely have backfired. Still, coming out of that meeting, I felt pretty anxious, but was immediately able to talk to some co-workers and process my experience. Due in part to a culture of care we had been building at the workplace for years, my co-workers were fully supportive of me and built me back up. Without my co-workers there to support me and validate my thoughts and feelings and tell me why the boss was wrong, I might have spent weeks or months feeling anxious at work and questioning my conduct. When this ground layer of support exists among workers, it will be of extra importance when you do directly confront the boss and make demands about working conditions. While being caring with co-workers and building up layers of mutual support might not fit the popular image of what real union organizing looks like, it is definitely an essential part of real union organizing. Organizing is all about relationships, and since caring about each other is the fundamental basis of all healthy relationships, building a network of care is central to strong and effective organizing. Inoculate as political education. Like with every section of AEIOU, we want to use open-ended questions as the main tool of inoculate. How do you think the boss will react if we do this? Walking through the possibilities, the good and the bad, and getting a sense of which possibilities are most likely better enables us to prepare for the boss's next move. Inoculate can also be an important place to tease out why the boss will react a certain way. Why do you think the boss will do that? A boss's personality and leadership style always conditions their behavior, but it's important to emphasize that the oppositional relationship between workers and bosses also conditions their behavior. Many bosses try to ingratiate themselves as the protector of their workers' interests and as a kind of parental figure of the workplace, and only a class analysis can help penetrate that facade and empower workers to think more clearly about how to take action effectively. While employers spend a lot of effort trying to obscure class tensions at work, a few well-placed questions are often all it takes to unmask the central dynamic of the capitalist workplace. The boss has power over you and they want to keep it that way. The boss said they want what's best for us, but they keep cutting our hours. Why do you think they do that? The boss says they are always open to talk about any issues people have at work, but why then do they keep yelling at people who raise issues? All of this might seem implied or intuitive when talking about grievances in the workplace, but making these connections explicit will help people internalize them and apply them to other grievances and circumstances. Make no promise you can't keep. Never make promises you can't keep during inoculation, as you don't have total control over what the boss does or doesn't do to either retaliate or concede to demands. Promises I hear organizers make that they shouldn't include, "You can't be fired for this and we're going to win this demand." Rather, emphasize that you're being honest with them, and organizing is about people being honest with each other. Only then can people feel they have the control over their information and actions that enables them to make a healthy choice for themselves. A worker once told me a story about how she and a lot of her co-workers were agitated about being subcontracted out and getting worse perks and benefits than others who were not subcontracted out but did the same job for the company. They started talking about a union and reached out to one. A union staff organizer told them to hold a meeting with all their co-workers to talk about getting a union. The staff organizer said they couldn't be retaliated against for putting together such a meeting because such retaliation for union organizing was illegal. When the meeting happened, someone snitched to management and this worker was fired. It fundamentally broke the trust she had with the organizer and led them to be mad not only at the employer, but at the staff organizer who was supposed to be there to help. The worker tried to keep building a union at her former workplace, but once she was not employed there, it became a lot harder. The worker filed an unfair labor practice lawsuit against the employer, but last I heard that case was still going through the official channels and the worker herself had moved on to other work and wouldn't retake her old job even if it was offered to her. Employers know that laws that protect workers from illegal firings are weak and slow, so they take advantage of this and fire workers anyway when they know it will weaken or kill a union campaign. This is so widely known in the labor movement that the staff organizer would have obviously known too. What would have happened instead if the staff organizer was more honest with the worker about the risks? What if the worker had been informed of the risks and been able to offset them by being more covert and/or waiting until later down the road when the campaign was stronger to do something so open that might risk retaliation? Also related to not making promises is not promising your co-workers that the boss will respond by giving in to your demands. I was on strike once and one of the constant refrains of union leadership was the claim that we were winning. I'm sure they wanted to keep morale high, and this certainly had that effect for some. But for me, I was much less certain whether the strike was going to get us something to be satisfied with, and promising as much up front was a big red flag to me. When the resolution of the strike was unsatisfying to a lot of people, there was a sense of betrayal. People felt misled. Now certainly not every action will result in victory, and sometimes you just have to accept a loss and process it with others. But to be promised a win and still lose is a careless and unnecessary way to breach the trust of workers who made real sacrifices and took real risks. One alternative way to frame this is to say that by not doing anything, things will stay the same. Taking action together often gives us the chance of solving these problems but also has risks. As a thoughtful organizer, hopefully you can find ways of taking action where the benefits outweigh the risks for most people. But it's not a foregone conclusion. And being honest with yourselves and each other is the best way to think clearly and help everyone come to the best decision. Sometimes, in discussing a potential action, you and others will conclude that the risks outweigh the benefits in that moment, and that's okay. Union organizing asterisk isn't T asterisk about taking action all the time, but rather is about taking action when it's to your advantage to do so. If you feel like you're not taking action often enough and are getting antsy, something I definitely feel when organizing seems slow going, try channeling that energy into having more one-on-one with co-workers because it's always strategic in the long term to keep building relationships. That way, when an opportunity to take action does come along, you'll be in a better position to take advantage of it. Inoculation against rash action. Sometimes you have a few co-workers who are fired up and want to take a big action immediately. As an organizer, you know sometimes rushing into action can end badly, so sometimes in Inoculate, you want to help people think through how a big action can backfire. You never want to tell people what to do, that's the boss's job, but expressing your concerns and your reasons why you think an action could end poorly or result in negative consequences is also an important thing for an organizer to do to help people make as informed a decision as possible. At one workplace where workers were being ordered back to work in person during COVID and before vaccines were widely available, a few of the workers were highly agitated and were pushing for everyone to not show up to work despite the order. Certainly, some kind of mass refusal could have been a highly effective tactic under the right circumstances, and many workplaces use tactics like these to good effect to extract demands from bosses or delay the return to in-person work. But in this case, only a few people out of dozens were resolved enough to want to try to refuse the work order. Some were afraid that if this tactic were attempted and only a few people participated, it wouldn't be strong enough to successfully resist the order, and those few who participated would be easy targets for retaliation. People's fears about the return to work order were as serious and sincere as any grievance has ever been, and the intensity of feeling certainly was enough to motivate a few people to keep pushing for the idea despite a broad lack of support from others. After a series of difficult conversations among co-workers who were most involved in organizing at this workplace, it was decided that a collective work stoppage wouldn't be effective here, and the idea was let go. Leaving the meeting where this decision was reached was depressing and discouraging to all involved, as it felt like the workers had lost, that despite months of organizing against inadequate COVID policy, in the end, it wasn't enough to stop the biggest threat the workers faced, that of returning to work in person. Nonetheless, those involved in the discussion did think it was the best decision. And in follow-up discussions in the following weeks, some organizers circled back and had conversations with people involved in those discussions. Without the follow-up discussions, it's easier for tensions to fester and cleavages between staff to widen, but with empathy and a desire for connection, things can heal and people can feel good enough about their co-workers to want to get involved in the next fight that comes along. Inoculation against Lone Ranger actions. Another variant of the inoculate conversation is one where someone wants to go it alone and you want to help them understand the dangers and ineffectiveness of such an approach. The most common version of this is where a worker is pissed off about something and wants to march into the boss's office to tell them about it. Many bosses cultivate an open-door policy, and for many workers, this seems like the only option available. Sometimes a worker wants to vent at the boss and pressure them with anger. Sometimes they want to try to persuade the boss and get them to be more reasonable. And sometimes they want to try to guilt the boss into doing the right thing. In my experience, none of those approaches are effective. As an organizer, you can share a story or two about what has happened when others have tried this tactic, as well as a story or two illustrating alternatives that have more to do with talking with their co-workers about it and finding more collective solutions. As ill-advised as it may seem to you, most of the time and for most issues, the boss will just kindly ignore individual pleas, and if you think there's no real danger in a co-worker going to the boss about an issue, then just sharing your reservations, but then wishing them good luck can be a learning experience in itself. In such cases, you'll want to follow up with the co-worker in the days after their conversation with the boss and ask them how it went. Why didn't anything change? Is a good way to circle back from inoculate through to agitate and educate. Don't let fear warp your own thinking. Another thing organizers should be careful about is to not get paranoid or overly alarmed about the dangers of an action. Bosses know that they have power over their employees, and often they will do what they can to play on people's fears psychologically, even if they can't realistically retaliate against someone with formal discipline. As an organizer, you likely care a tremendous amount for your co-workers and want them to be safe, but you'll do best with inoculation if you're not letting your own personal fears and worst-case scenarios color what you tell others. In the aftermath of one work stoppage where more than a dozen workers participated, a couple workers were misled to believe that they were all going to be fired, and they started telling everyone how much immediate danger they were all in. Given employer policy and past practice, that almost surely wasn't the case, but in convincing a couple of the workers who participated to believe this, the boss was able to instill a tremendous amount of fear in everyone who participated, and prospects for future actions were diminished by everyone being scared stiff about intense retaliation. In the end, some workers were given a warning, and one worker received a heavier formal discipline, but no one was fired. And while it was shitty for them to go through that, and certainly was not to be taken lightly, it was a far cry from the fears that the boss had instilled that lead to an atmosphere of paranoia and paralysis. In situations like this, it's best to reach out to trusted organizers outside of your own circle and get their feedback. Hopefully, when armed with a more accurate picture of the situation, you can talk with your co-workers about dangers and fears without inflating them in a way that unnecessarily discourages organizing or strains relationships. An organizer's guilt. Taking action against the boss nearly always entails some risk, and you and your co-workers will feel like superheroes when actions go well and you all get what you want. But when actions fail or fall apart or lead to retaliation, the feelings of defeat and regret can be overwhelming. If things don't go well, the first thing organizers do is look back at their inoculation and see if they really did their best to prepare and inform everyone of the risks. If you feel that everyone knew the risks and took action anyway and it still failed, debrief with people about it and process the emotions and consequences together. If in looking back you find fault with your inoculation, it's common for organizers to feel guilty and ashamed. This is honestly something every organizer will experience at some point, and there's no magic potion to make it go away, other than to recognize that missteps are human and fighting bosses isn't easy. As with most things in life, the best thing an organizer can do when things go wrong is admit mistakes, draw lessons in order to not repeat those mistakes, seek outside support and counsel, and repair any relationships that were damaged. I've been fortunate enough to not have any high-stakes actions blow up in my face, but in a couple cases where things didn't go as planned, I've felt bad about not having inoculated people better. Organizers are usually motivated by a desire to make things better for themselves and their co-workers, and when it feels like they inadvertently made things worse, it can lead them to question everything. The best way to avoid a catastrophic mistake as an organizer is to never, ever, never ever pressure someone to take a risk. Talk with your coworkers about how to fix problems, how to take action, and what the risks are, but make sure they feel totally aware of the possibilities and in total control of the decision to take a risk when the moment arrives. If someone feels like they just went along with an action that later turns sour and that they weren't given the opportunity to stop and think for themselves, they might resent the organizer for what happened or never want to be involved in organizing again. Especially for higher risk actions, it is helpful to explicitly pose the question of participation to everyone involved at some point leading up to the action, to give everyone the opportunity to raise questions, have time to think it through, and then verbally declare themselves in or out. Validate whatever answer they give. If they say no, tell them you understand, you respect their decision, and you will keep them updated on what happens. If they say yes, bolster their confidence with, "I feel the same way, let's do this." How to design actions that limit potential retaliation. On the other side of the spectrum from open, high-stakes confrontations with the boss are actions that are covert. Sometimes, power in the workplace is exercised in plain sight, and sometimes it's exercised beneath the surface. Bosses are often experts at manipulating things in ways workers have no way of knowing about. Exercising power beneath the surface is something workers can use to good effect as well. In going through inoculation with co-workers who are planning an action and trying to anticipate the boss's reaction, you might discover it's possible to rethink your action in such a way as to be more covert and make retaliation much less likely. Covert actions are especially useful in cases where workers don't feel strong enough to stand up to the boss openly. The prototypical workplace action is the march on the boss, where a group of co-workers march into the boss's office and make a specific demand. This can be an effective and empowering tactic. However, one of the downsides of such a tactic is that the boss immediately knows who was involved in the action. There are alternative ways to apply pressure to the boss using direct action, but that also can conceal organizing and protect people from potential retaliation. One organizer friend of mine was at a workplace where they were given a new work calendar, where a few days were being added to their annual work schedule, but without any change in their salaries. The boss asked for feedback on the new schedule first, in the form of comments on a Google Doc, and then later at a staff meeting. But the solicitation of feedback was just a formality, and the boss frankly expected no one to notice the change in workdays buried in the spreadsheet. But once workers caught wind of the meaning of the change, they started discussing what they could do to push back. The plan they came up with was that a bunch of them would give feedback on the Google Doc, pointing out the change and how they thought it didn't seem fair. The first person to leave a Google Doc comment was someone universally seen as a rule follower, so as to throw off any hint of organized troublemaking. Then, a deluge of comments from other staff would create the effect of showing the boss that the new schedule was deeply unpopular and that trying to force it through would damage the boss's relationships with her staff. Most importantly, the whole action was conceived so that this outpouring of dissent would appear spontaneous. Instead of loudly announcing that this was a direct action in the way a march on the boss does, this action gave the boss the impression that people were just speaking their minds. The action was largely successful in that most, but not all, of the extra days were shaved off of next year's schedule. The boss threw a fit at the staff meeting where the calendar was discussed. The organizer inoculated co-workers against this in advance, but no one was specifically retaliated against, and the boss never learned what had actually happened. Organizers in my orbit have used variations on this kind of action numerous times to good effect, and I'm convinced this can be a regular tool in the organizer's action toolbox. Conclusion. Inoculation is about taking action with eyes wide open. As with any contest of strategy, thinking through your opponent's next moves will help you make better moves yourself. If people were properly inoculated before taking an action that wasn't successful, people will be more likely to be proud of their actions anyway, to have stood up for what they believed in and taken their best shot. Inoculation will help us avoid bad losses and will make the unavoidable losses not as bad. Whether a particular action succeeds or fails, capitalism will probably still be there to fight again tomorrow. What our labor organizing needs more than anything is people who are able to stick it out over the long term, and inoculation is the most important tool we have for sustaining our fight. #O is for organize. Introduction. ***. The organize part of AEIOU in 1-on-1S is about getting people involved in the concrete tasks of organizing ***. After having agitated with someone around grievances, created a plan in educate, considered the boss's next moves, and addressed people's fears in inoculate, you are in position to put the rubber to the road. What do we do now? Just as workplace problems are complex, so are workplace solutions involving collective action. The organizer can help break the problem down into chunks and separate the solution out into a series of manageable tasks. In supporting people who are new to organizing and motivated to solve problems at work, the organizer's role is to discuss with people what needs to be done and how to do it. One of the contradictions of being an organizer is the opposition between the speed and effectiveness of doing things yourself versus taking the time to show others how to do things. Everything an organizer does can be done by someone else, and if the organizer already knows how to do it, the aims of the organizing will be served in the long term by showing someone else how to do things instead of doing them oneself. More people, more knowledge, more skills, these are the tributaries which flow together to create working-class power. Against the short-term interest of completing specific tasks quickly, it is in the long-term interest of the organizer to, as much as possible, help others learn to do the things that result in direct action that improves workers' lives. Dispensing tasks versus collaborating on them. There are innumerable ways to split up and distribute tasks among people who are organizing. When things are hot and moving fast, a different set of guidelines often applies, but the discussion below is relevant for the kind of gradual organizing conditions that holds for 97% of the time. Let me start by criticizing the way that distribution of tasks is often talked about in activist circles, which I shall call the Great Dispenser theory of task distribution. This theory is sometimes just used as a shorthand for a more involved process, but its flaws are real enough in actual practice. This image of organizing depicts a master organizer who has all the right tasks ready to dispense to workers, handing them out like candy bars on Halloween. A worker comes up to an organizer and is pissed off about something, and the organizer has just the right task, which they dispense to the worker, and the worker goes off on their own to complete the task, and whammo. That's some delicious organizing. This model of task distribution mostly just works for a small subset of workers. Those who already have the motivation, initiative, confidence, and basic skill set necessary to complete some non-trivial task. However, most workers who are brand new to organizing and agitated about working conditions don't already possess this combination of qualities, and so just giving them tasks will result in them getting confused, deflated, or overwhelmed, and they won't complete the task. Even after a worker has grievances and wants to do something about it, it may take them a while to work up the confidence to start doing tasks. So just dispensing tasks to people won't help and may actually hurt by making co-workers feel pressured to do something they're not ready for yet. There's been countless instances where I've talked with co-workers or other workers in my industry who are agitated about conditions and interested in changing them. But it's taken them a while, from days or in some cases, even years, to work up the confidence, understanding, and motivation to take the leap from inaction to action. Certainly my own early days of organizing were not filled with rapid-fire task execution, but were characterized more by talking with people about things, gradually getting comfortable with this new way of seeing and doing things, and only wading into actual organizing when things started to make sense and feel right. When someone is taking on a certain kind of task for the first time, I prefer to do it with them as much as possible. After we talk about an issue and identify some task that needs to get done that moves towards solving some workplace problem, we then do the task together from beginning to end. Along the way, I show how I've done it in the past, but leave room for us to do it differently if there's a better way. This approach has the advantage of simultaneously building relationships and doesn't allow someone to fail by being left on their own and losing motivation or confidence. Organizing is all about relationships, and if you're emphasizing, strengthening, growing, and leaning on relationships at every stage of your organizing, you'll do better than just dispensing tasks for people to go off and do on their own. After someone has done a task alongside someone else, they'll be able to do it on their own the next time. Rather than seeing myself as a great dispenser, and there's plenty of organizers who do this, who centers my organizing with co-workers around questions like, what's the ideal task to give this co-worker? I found it much more helpful to constantly be asking, what can I do together with this co-worker? Seeing myself more as a dance partner who hears the music and plays off the other person's movements and affections than a captain of a ship who is constantly directing others what to do has been much more successful for me. Sometimes there's a task that someone has to do on their own, and that doesn't lend itself easily to doing it together for their first time. For example, if a worker at another workplace is ready to start having one-on-one-s with co-workers around a grievance at work, it might not make sense for you to go along with them to these one-on-one-s. As with all organizing, with these kinds of tasks, you try to talk it through with them, ask them about aspects of it that sound challenging. Find ways to think through and prepare for those challenges and boost their confidence. Treading lightly. How then should we decide between different ways of distributing tasks? A good rule of thumb is to intervene as little as possible while setting people up to be able to deal successfully with a workplace issue. In its most heavy-handed form, organizers can single-handedly fix the problem for their co-worker, and certainly that's appropriate sometimes given the specific conditions and issue at hand. But in most cases, this approach is detrimental to organizing because it doesn't utilize the power of collective action, doesn't give people agency over solving their problems, and doesn't give them the skills and experience to solve their problems on their own next time. Next on the spectrum of intervention is dispensing a task to someone and telling them what to do and how to do it. If time is short and a task needs to be completed pronto, maybe being so direct is appropriate. A softer approach, which is more widely applicable, is to do a task with someone, as described above, and for many workers who are brand new to organizing, I've found this to be ideal. If a worker already has the willingness and ability to do a task themselves, sometimes only the lightest intervention is necessary, where all you have to do is ask a few basic questions about what they think is the best way to approach the issue, and they'll come up with a task and execute on their own. Imagine a co-worker isn't getting their breaks and they come to you about it. Maybe you're a union rep at your workplace, or maybe you're just known to your co-workers as someone who will stand up for them. Sometimes a co-worker will come to you and expect you to tell the boss to give them their breaks. Maybe you could do that, but knowing what you do about collective action That is, the boss doesn't just change policies because you individually tell them to do so, and the importance of people being able to fix problems themselves and not be dependent on others, there's other ways you could respond. Rather than try to go to the boss on your own, you can ask the coworker if they've heard of anyone else having a similar issue, and who could we check in with to find out. Without drawing out every step of this example, I hope it's clear that good organizers can find ways to empower others and make organizing more collective instead of making others dependent on you. Whether someone new to organizing is taking on a task on their own or with you, it's helpful to stir in some agitation at this point too. Sometimes the discussion and execution of tasks can seem tedious or irrelevant if people don't understand how it relates to the issue that they care about or that affects them. Throughout discussion of some task, you can continually discuss the connections between the problem at hand and how the task is part of the solution. Needs and interests. Each organization has its own methods and goals that intersect with each individual's needs and interests in different ways. Part of the organizer's job is to link together individual needs and interests into a chain that hauls the organization forward. Nowhere is this more important than when co-workers start to take on organizing tasks themselves. By needs, I mean those more basic things people require to feel satisfied. To simplify things a little, most basic needs boil down to people wanting to be in community with others, wanting to be challenged, wanting to be valued, and wanting to make the world a better place. Luckily for us, when organizing is done right, it is very potent at fulfilling these needs. Organizers at the top of their game can get all of these needs met with people in each interaction they have, be it a meeting, a one-on-one, or a direct action. For example, if an organizer is having a one-on-one with a coworker about how they're not getting their breaks at work, the coworker will feel in community because they have someone in their work community who they can share problems with and get support from. The coworker can feel challenged to think through what can be done to fix this problem, and the coworker can feel valued by being recognized for taking on an issue that affects them and others. The world is a better place if everyone gets their breaks than when people don't get their breaks, and additionally, the power workers have to keep making the world better will increase as more issues are identified and resolved. The best place for someone to meet these needs is to participate themselves in the tasks of organizing and taking action, which is what the organized part of AEIOU is about. But as much as individual organizers can do to help people get their needs met through organizing, organizations as a whole need infrastructure in place to help needs get met for everyone involved. Without taking a lengthy detour, I'll just note that some ways orgs can do this is having systematic ways of checking in on people and having members engage each other in one-on-one have meetings be designed thoughtfully with people's needs in mind instead of narrowly focusing on what the org needs to do, have trainings where people learn the practices of the org so people can actively participate themselves instead of just receive orders from above. Many orgs do these things haphazardly instead of consistently and systematically, and it is why so many groups that purport to focus on building grassroots power stay small and insular. Interests are specific things people like to do that help meet their needs. Some people like facilitating meetings. Some like setting up social hours with co-workers. Some like reading and researching about issues, and so on. In helping people figure out tasks they want to do in organizing, whatever an organizer can do to learn about and engage people's interests as a way to meet their needs will go a long way. Blaming your coworkers isn't organizing. You have all the ideas in place for what the problem is and what needs to be done about it, but when it comes to actually implementing those ideas by taking on tasks that move towards direct action, you discover things aren't so simple or smooth. After reading about organizing or attending a union training, people will naturally want to jump into the dramatic and exciting stuff, only to realize after a few attempts that none of that seems practical or achievable, despite checking all the boxes that they thought they needed to take direct action. Maybe not everyone agrees on what the main workplace issues are. Maybe people are too busy to meet up outside of work to talk about issues. Maybe the turnover is too high for people to be around long enough to care about issues. Maybe people don't seem very interested in talking with you about workplace issues despite their constant complaints about them. Maybe people keep thinking that the boss is trying their best to fix things, and we just have to wait for them to handle it. I've certainly stubbed my organizer toe on each of these obstacles before when trying to move from talking about workplace problems, as often happens in AEI, to doing something about them, as with O. The default response to these kinds of blocks is to get frustrated and then blame our co-workers for not caring or being radical enough. Unfortunately, blaming our co-workers for all of capitalism's problems is not a very effective approach for attacking capitalism. Rather than blaming co-workers for all of capitalism's problems, it's helpful to see people's reluctance to solve workplace problems as the effect of capitalism's structuring of the workplace. Whatever you might believe in moments of frustration, your co-workers aren't the ones designing capitalism and implementing it and benefiting from it. Bosses spend a lot of effort getting people to not care about what affects them at work and thinking there's no other way things can be done. Your co-workers might go along with capitalism to varying degrees, but they're not the source of the problem. Capitalism's structuring of the workplace and the resulting power dynamics are the problem. And this is a real and immediate problem, not just an abstract one or one that you can safely dismiss as you try to organize. The best way to tackle these kinds of problems in the workplace is to slow down. If it looks like you can't get enough people on board in the immediate future to march into the boss's office to demand everyone gets their full breaks, don't try to force it. If co-workers don't seem to care or want to do anything to solve problems, it's probably more a result of feeling powerless and not knowing or trusting people than it is a reflection of their inherent apathy or conservatism. In the context of a one-on-one you're having with a worker, when you get to the organized part of AEIOU, if there's no pressing grievance or impending action, it's often best to just focus on specific tasks that help people get to know their co-workers better. While this might not feel or look like real organizing, compared to what we're often led to think real organizing is like, it is. Really it is, I promise. Whether it's finding ways to talk to people more on the job or in the break room, trying to get coffee with someone, going to happy hour after work with a work group, having everyone sign a card for someone's birthday, whatever you can do to just get to know your co-workers is the best organizing to be done much of the time. After you've built up these relationships, then grievances and ideas for action will much more naturally begin to surface, and as an organizer, you'll be paddling with the current instead of against it. One workplace I was organizing at had been characterized by long periods of outward apathy and rigid compliance by co-workers. Especially earlier in my time organizing there, this fortress of the status quo seemed impenetrable, and I often doubted whether anything could change. So many co-workers seemed to fit the perfect stereotypes of those people in wider society who would never go against the grain, who thought they had no skin in the game, who would sooner sacrifice themselves than risk disobeying orders. But in building relationships with co-workers, gaining another organizing buddy, and slowly building up a counter-presence to the boss's influence, the ground began to shift under our feet. We were never able to reach everyone, and even most of the time, most people still went along with the orders from above. But in moments of crisis and turmoil, which the contradictions of capitalism inevitably bring about, we were able to polarize issues in such a way that the staff as a whole seemed to move against the fortress. The walls crumbled, and real gains were made. This was always and only possible because so much work had been put into really building up trust and care between co-workers so people could more openly explore what they felt and what they wanted with each other. Of course, when the crisis passed, capitalism was still standing, and the status quo fortress at our workplace was rebuilt, but it not as strong as before. It no longer appeared invincible, and we knew better how to maneuver around and through it. Don't pressure people. Of all the steps of AEIOU, organize is where people make the mistake of pressuring people to do things. This is understandable because so much of activist culture is based on doing big things and fast and creating a sense of urgency that things have to be done right away. A large portion of news and media about activism uses this frame because it creates a compelling story that can stand out from a lot of the background noise of the media landscape. However, rushing things and trying to do big things right away is like jumping into the deep end of a pool without ever having tried to swim before. You'll flail around frantically and possibly hurt yourself and others. The number one mistake of rushing comes from pressuring people to do things. When people feel pressured to do things, they feel uncomfortable, they feel like their boundaries are being disrespected, and they feel like they're not being listened to or valued. At one workplace, an organizer I knew was nudging everyone to go confront the bosses at a big meeting over some unfair firings. Some workers expressed reservations about their own job security if such an action were attempted. They refused to take on tasks related to the action, and then they took a back seat as the organizer didn't listen to any of the reservations and kept driving things forward. The action seemed like a victory when it happened, as the demands were tentatively met, but soon after the action was over, nearly all of the boss's concessions were reversed and a wave of retaliation descended on some of those who were, or were perceived to be, involved. It turned out that the reservations expressed by some initially were entirely accurate. The situation could have been handled much better if things had moved more slowly, if the organizer had listened to others, and if they had all come up with an approach that everyone felt respected their needs. As it actually played out, this action has become my personal textbook example of how not to organize. It's entirely possible to go through agitate, educate, inoculate, but when you get to organize, people still feel uneasy about actually taking on a task. The respectful response to this is to go at the speed that their concerns dictate. If you encounter resistance, try to open up a space for them to speak to their hesitation. Maybe it's best to back up and go through agitate, educate, and inoculate again to see if there's anything important that was missed before about what this person thought and felt about the grievance or the action. Maybe the reasons behind the resistance can be talked through and overcome. Maybe the reasons require someone to not take on a task at the moment, or maybe the task being discussed is actually just not the right one for the situation, and the person you're talking with can help find other, more useful tasks if you slow down and think about it together. Earlier in my organizing life, I was talking with someone who was relatively new to my organization, but who I knew had a deep commitment to organizing and leftist politics. We were putting on a big event, and I wanted this person to reach out to others in their network to pull them into the event. During a one-on-one, they expressed interest in helping with the event, but when I suggested they talk to their friends and get them to come, they got kind of quiet. Maybe they didn't think their friends would be interested, maybe they were shy about asking their friends, maybe they had their own reservations about the event that they hadn't shared with me yet. In any case, when I encountered this quiet, I took it more as a sign that they needed that extra push instead of a sign that I should slow down. The extra push I gave them made them even more quiet, and I'm certain they didn't talk to their friends about the event. In fact, I saw very little of this person in the months after that one-on-one. I felt like I breached the trust that we had started to build between us. This was an entirely avoidable mistake I've resolved not to repeat. There's a difference between building someone up and giving them the resources and confidence to internally overcome their fears and hesitations themselves and pressuring them externally with exhortations and appeals to urgency. The latter kind of pushing sadly passes for legitimate organizing in a lot of spaces, but should be rejected by organizers who want to create nourishing and sustainable orgs. If you value the trust in your relationships with people over trying to create a big media splash or rush to the next big win, you'll be a better person and a better organizer. Organizing is not about pushing people to do things, but rather is about helping people be who they want to be by opening up opportunities to come together with others to solve problems. The organize part of AEIOU is where people are invited to get in on the collective action. U is for uplift. Introduction. Asterisk, asterisk. The uplift part of AEIOU is where we follow up and check in with people. Sometimes we're following up specifically about tasks, and sometimes we're checking in generally about how they're organizing and life is going. In the previous post in this series on the Organize part of AEIOU, I highlighted how we should avoid as much as possible leaving new people on their own to organize. There's many steps to take from first getting involved to becoming experienced and knowledgeable about the many aspects of organizing, and taking each step in community with others helps foster relationships and share best practices. But no matter how collective we make organizing, there are still countless moments where people have to do something on their own, where they have to overcome some part of themselves and their environment using their own resources and confidence. When people complete a task for the first time, it's good to follow up and debrief with them about how it went. When people don't complete a task, it's good to follow up and see if there's anything you can do to support them. A lot of the same concepts used for task follow-up can also be applied to general check-ins. Life is hard, workplaces are complex, co-workers are complicated, capitalism is a big, bad jerk, and sometimes organizing doesn't go as planned. Uplift is about staying in relationship with people through the ups and downs of organizing. Obstacles to people completing tasks. Following up with people about tasks is only helpful if you have a positive relationship with them and they feel like you are there to support them. Without that, following up will feel to them like micromanaging and give them the impression that they are being used. As with every part of organizing, put the relationship first in uplift. Let's say you had a one-on-one with your co-worker Brenda where they were agitated about there not being enough staff on the lunch shift at a restaurant, so together you came up with a tentative plan to talk with other co-workers about this to see if others were also frustrated about this. Brenda thought this was a good idea and offered to talk with Tom about it sometime over the next week. A couple weeks pass, and Brenda doesn't say anything to you and you bring it up, and she says she hasn't gotten around to it yet. In workplace organizing trainings, I learned that there are 4 main reasons why people don't follow through on tasks. For each of the main reasons, there is a straightforward way for the organizer to respond to help someone over the obstacle. Sometimes your support will help them overcome the obstacle, and sometimes it won't, and that's okay. As long as you're truly there to support people and value your relationship with them and not narrowly fixated on task completion, you'll be moving in the right direction. Asterisk, asterisk. The first reason people don't follow through on tasks is a lack of resources. Maybe Brenda is too busy with her second job or can't get childcare to find time away from her kid to go have a one-on-one with Tom. Asterisk, asterisk. When lack of resources is the problem, supporting them involves offering resources. Ask Brenda if having 2 weeks instead of 1 would be more reasonable, or if you could watch her kids sometime while she met up with Tom over coffee. Asterisk, asterisk. The second reason is a lack of skills or confidence. Maybe Brenda has never before met up with a co-worker outside of work before to talk about grievances. Doing so for the first time can be intimidating. Asterisk, asterisk. When a lack of skills or confidence is the problem, supporting them means helping that person build up their skills and confidence. As an organizer, you can ask them what feels most awkward or challenging about talking to Tom, help think through how to make it feel comfortable, and you can share about the approach you take when you talk to co-workers about grievances. You can also remind them of all of their positive qualities that makes people want to connect with them. Asterisk, asterisk. The third reason is a lack of motivation. Perhaps Brenda just doesn't seem to care as much about the grievance in the days after she agreed to talk to Tom about it. Asterisk, asterisk. When a lack of motivation is the problem, supporting them can entail returning to the agitate part of AEIOU. Agitation in union organizing isn't primarily about making people mad, but is about wiping away all of the things that disconnect us from our many emotions about work. In this situation, agitation is about checking in to see, underneath all of the coping mechanisms, if this is a grievance Brenda feels strongly enough to want to do something about. If so, try to talk through again how it affects them and how that led them to want to address the grievance in the first place. Asterisk, asterisk. The last reason is fear. If Brenda is afraid that the boss will find out about what they're doing or will react harshly to any kind of action, she might give up on her task. Asterisk, asterisk. When fear is the problem, supporting them can mean returning to the inoculate part of AEIOU. Looking more closely at the fears, at what people need to feel comfortable taking action, and at how to anticipate and prepare for the boss's next moves can be helpful here. Good organizing is rooted in supporting people in better understanding their relationship to the workplace and supporting them in improving the conditions around them. And bad organizing comes from telling people what to do and telling them when they're doing it wrong. Obstacles aren't always visible on the surface. While the 4 reasons people don't complete tasks helps you find the best way to support your co-workers, people are often not so transparent about their wants and needs in such a situation that you can easily identify the obstacle and provide support to overcome it. There's no easy tricks for talking with people about these things, but the best advice I've found is to keep going back to the basics of relationship-based organizing. Ask open-ended questions, listen carefully, keep building trust, validate their concerns, and offer support. People will often say one reason as a cover for another. It requires less vulnerability to tell someone you dropped a task because of some external issue, like being busy with a second job, than it is to admit an internal obstacle, such as feeling anxious about not knowing how to do something or being fearful of retaliation. Having a foundation of trust between yourself and your co-workers makes it easier to talk about and potentially address sensitive things that otherwise might get lost in the mix. A caring and thoughtful organizer can find ways to respectfully open doors to conversations about more vulnerable topics without barging through. This is where task-specific follow-up blends together with general check-in. Beyond the specific 4 reasons someone doesn't do a task, there may be more general challenges they face in their organizing. If someone struggles with some aspect of organizing, of course, it would be insensitive to keep giving them tasks to struggle with. Some common general challenges I've seen people have in organizing in general include social anxiety at having to talk to people a lot, questioning their political conviction in organizing as a method of change, fear of conflict with the boss, compromising their job, and the uncertainty that direct action can actually make things better. For each person, these things will be bound up with all sorts of complicated details and past experiences far beyond what could be usefully covered in a blog post. The best thing an organizer can do is stay in relationship with co-workers over the long term to give time and space for people to work things out with the support of the people around them. To be a broken record, the solution here is to treat people with care and understanding and not to rush or pressure people. Aggressive organizing styles that are sometimes taught give off the impression that organizing is all about doing the thing, like taking collective action and pushing others to do the thing, and doing the thing is the only thing that matters, and so everything else must be subordinated to doing the thing. Sure, there's a lot of problems in the world, and it's important that we eventually get around to solving them. And of course, disagreement comes with any kind of political terrain, and conflict within groups is as natural as spring rain or summer sun. But the kind of callousness that I'm objecting to here is the very common organizing situation where people agree largely what the issue is, but then some people take that agreement as license to start pushing everyone to do things. The attitude seems to be that being pushy is how we get things done. Sometimes organizing meetings are made to feel like war rooms, with generals barking orders, and the hurried sense of urgency puts everyone in a panic that they need to do everything right away. My biggest fear is that gentleness gets suffocated in such organizing spaces. Rather, the gentleness that we carry inside of ourselves should be treated as one of the greatest assets in our organizing instead of a hindrance. In my own organizing, I've been so much more successful and felt so much better when I've gone at the pace of the people around me. Sometimes things naturally move fast because people are on the same page and really believe in themselves and each other to move quickly to address something. But often, the natural pace is slower, and there's a lot of difficult things that organizing brings to the surface that we need to slow down to address. In such circumstances, gentleness is like a seasonal rain that gradually floods entire landscapes and leaves behind only the most fertile soil. Feelings and organizing. The most powerful words in organizing are, "How does that make you feel?" This can be effective when talking about workplace grievances in the agitate part of organizing conversations. In the uplift part, this question is equally effective in asking people how some task or aspect of organizing is going. The question communicates that you care about their feelings and that you want to hear what they're going through. This may all seem rather obvious, but I guess I'm still learning myself how powerful these words are and how they can be applied to almost any situation. Just like we want people to be able to feel things openly about their working conditions, we want them to be able to feel openly about organizing. Organizing is often hard and can be distinctly not fun at times, but as organizers we'll have the most success if, even through the hard parts, we feel good about our organizing and help others feel good about their organizing in turn. When some part of organizing doesn't feel good, you can get curious about that and look to discover why that is and what can be changed so that it feels good again. Of course, good feelings are hardly ends in themselves, but they are the barometers we have for when our organizing has purpose, when it is aligned with our values, and when it is meeting our needs. One thing that's essential to people feeling good about their organizing in the long term is that they have at least one other person in their organizing circles who they feel close to and can go to with problems and who checks in on them. In my org, we've created a committee of people who are always having one-on-one conversations with members, and ideally everyone comes to feel a trusting connection with at least one other veteran member in the group. Conclusion. Organizing should not be like a quarterback blitz where the star organizer tries to rush up the middle and come up with the big win. Organizing should be about the gradual and sustained work of building grassroots power, and this is only possible in the context of creating trusting relationships, discussing shared conditions, exploring shared values, and taking collective action. Bonds are created between workers through the exercise of collective agency and action, but no less important is regularly pausing and tending to these relationships. When your co-workers know you as caring and trustworthy, they'll be there for you when you need it too.